Welcome to a channel dedicated to narrating history. Our purpose is understanding. We take complex, often contested pasts and present and present them with clarity, care, and fidelity to the sources. We will explore History of the Jews in Russia and Poland by Simon Dubnow. Listen carefully, follow the record, subscribe, and follow the story. Chapter 2. Jewish Presence in Poland. What you have heard so far is the long prelude to a much larger story. We have followed the earliest path of Jewish settlement into Eastern Europe, beginning along the northern shores of the Black Sea, where Jewish communities took root within the Greek world, preserved their faith, and built organized communal life at the edge of antiquity. We have seen how these settlements endured through Roman and Byzantine rule, how they became centers of trade, learning, and resistance, and how they stood at the crossroads of paganism, Christianity, and Judaism. We have traced the rise of the Khazar kingdom, a rare and striking moment in history when a powerful state adopted Judaism and offered refuge to persecuted Jews from Byzantium and beyond. For a time, Khazar stood as a living answer to exile a Jewish-ruled realm, bound into the great commercial networks of Eurasia. We have also witnessed its fall, crushed by the growing power of the Rus and the dispersal of its people into Crimea, Kiev, and neighboring lands. From there, the narrative carried us into the early history of Kievan Rus, where Jewish settlers contributed to commerce and urban life, yet faced increasing hostility shaped by Byzantine religious ideology. Legends, church teachings, and political alliances hardened suspicion into violence, giving rise to the first pogroms and setting patterns that would echo for centuries. We have seen Jewish life persist through fire, conquest, and migration under Tatar Khans, Genoese merchants, Ottoman rulers, and Lithuanian princes, while Muscovy emerged as a land closed to Jews, marked by fear, intolerance, and repression. Here, at this point in the record, the foundations are laid. The ancient Black Sea world is fading. New powers are rising. Jewish communities are shifting north and west into Poland, Lithuania, and the lands that will soon dominate Eastern Europe. From here, the story continues not as a beginning, but as a turning point. The story now turns westward. While Jewish life along the shores of the Black Sea had grown out of the Greek, Byzantine, and Islamic worlds, the Jewish presence in Poland followed a very different path. Here, the settlers came not from the east, but from Western Europe, from the lands shaped by German culture and the Latin Christian Church. This division was not accidental. It reflected the deeper pool of history itself. The Slavic lands of Russia leaned toward the east, toward Byzantium and the steppe. Poland, by contrast, turned steadily toward the west. Long before Poland formally entered the Christian world, it had already become a commercial extension of Germany. The river valleys of the Varta and the Vistula lay closest to Western Europe, and merchants moved along them naturally. For Jewish traders, whose livelihoods depended on long-distance exchange, these routes were irresistible. As early as the 9th century of the Christian era, Jews living in the German provinces of the empire, founded by Charlemagne, were trading with neighboring Slavic lands. They crossed borders with their goods, visited Polish settlements, and in time, some of these temporary journeys became permanent homes. From this shadowy early period, no firm records survive. Instead, what has reached us are legends, blurred reflections of memory rather than reliable history. One such legend tells of a dramatic moment in the middle of the 9th century. After the death of Prince Popiel, the Poles gathered in Kruszwica, their ancient capital, to choose a new ruler. Unable to agree, they decided to leave the choice to fate. The first man to enter the town the next morning would become prince. At dawn, the gates opened, and the first to walk in was a Jew named Abraham Prokovnik. Seized by the crowd and proclaimed ruler, he refused the crown and instead urged them to choose a wise Pole named Piast, who then became the founder of the Piast dynasty. Another legend places Jews at the center of Polish history at the end of the 9th century. According to this tale, a delegation of Jews from Germany approached Prince Leszek of Poland, seeking permission to settle in his lands. Leszek questioned them closely about Jewish law and morals, weighing their answers with care. Satisfied, he granted their request. Large numbers of Jews arrived, and in the year 905 they were said to have received written privileges documents later lost to time. These stories are not factual in a strict sense. They were created centuries later and embroidered with imagination. Yet they carry a kernel of truth. They point to the presence of Jews in pagan Poland and suggest their German origin, even before Christianity reshaped the land. A decisive change came in the year 966, when Poland formally adopted Latin Christianity. This step bound the country not only to the German emperors, but also to the bishops of Rome. Contact with Germany intensified. Merchants, clergy, settlers, and ideas crossed the borders in growing numbers, and among them came Jews. At first, this migration was slow, driven mainly by trade. But soon, a far more powerful force came into play. In the year 1096, the First Crusade erupted. Across Western Europe, waves of armed pilgrims surged eastward, fired by religious zeal. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Jewish communities were attacked, plundered, and slaughtered. In nearby Bohemia, crusaders fell upon the Jews of Prague, forcing conversions at sword point. Faced with violence from both the mob and the authorities, many Bohemian Jews fled toward Poland, a land not yet touched by the crusading armies. Even when Prince Vratislav of Bohemia robbed these refugees as they passed through his territory in the year 1098, the exodus did not stop. Life under open hostility had become unbearable. From this moment onward, a steady stream of Jewish refugees flowed into Poland from the German lands. Each new crusade, those of the years 1146 to 1147, and again in 1196, deepened the suffering in Germany and swelled the movement eastward. During the 12th and 13th centuries, royal authority in Germany proved too weak to protect Jews, who were legally classified as dependents of the imperial treasury, but abandoned in practice to mob violence and church decrees. Faced with burning synagogues, forced baptisms, and recurring massacres, thousands chose flight over despair. Poland became their refuge. They settled first in regions closest to the German border: Krakow, Posen, Kalish, and Cilicia. There, Jewish colonies began to take firm root. Yet peace was not without strain. In the second half of the 12th century, Poland fractured into feudal principalities, each ruled by its own prince. With political fragmentation came social tension. In the year 1173, Prince Mstislav III, known as the Old, ruler of Great Poland, was forced to intervene. Violence against Jews, especially attacks carried out by Christian students from church and monastery schools, had grown so severe that the prince issued strict orders forbidding such assaults. Those who attacked Jews were to be heavily fined. Despite these tensions, the rulers themselves largely recognized the value of Jewish settlement. Under Mstislav the Old, Casimir the Just, and Leszek the White, at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries, Jews administered and leased the royal mints of Great and Little Poland. Coins from this period survive, bearing the names of Polish princes written in Hebrew letters, a striking symbol of trust and cooperation. By the early 13th century, between the years 1203 and 1207, Jews were even recorded as owning land and estates in Silesia. As these communities grew, their ties to Western Europe deepened not only economically but spiritually. A contemporary Bohemian scholar, Rabbi Eliezer of the Tosafist tradition, tells us that Jews in Poland, Russia, and Hungary lacked learned authorities of their own. They therefore invited rabbis, cantors, and teachers from abroad, most likely from Germany, and paid them for their service. At the same time, young Jewish scholars traveled westward to study. From Germany, Polish Jews inherited their language, a German dialect that would gradually develop into Yiddish. They also absorbed religious traditions and communal structures. Yet all of this existed only in early, fragile form, still unfolding. By the 13th century, Polish princes began to grasp the full economic importance of Jewish immigration. Their lands remained largely agricultural, divided between landowners and peasants. Trade, industry, and finance were underdeveloped. Into this gap stepped the Jews, forming what might be called a third estate. They brought capital into circulation, leased estates, farmed salt mines and customs duties, and provided credit. In this early period, relations between Jews and the native population were largely peaceful. But this balance did not last. From the West came two corrosive influences. The Church pressed its doctrines upon Poland through papal legates, insisting that anti-Jewish church laws be enforced. At the same time, German Christian settlers arrived in large numbers, invited by Polish rulers eager to modernize their towns. These settlers received extensive privileges and self-government under German municipal law, known as the Law of Magdeburg. As merchants and craftsmen, they became direct competitors of Jewish traders, and they carried with them the spirit of religious hostility and economic rivalry familiar from Germany. Even the most capable Polish rulers struggled to contain these tensions. They needed Jewish enterprise for the prosperity of the land, yet faced pressure from the church and from Christian settlers. One such ruler was Boleslav of Kalisz, called the Pious. In the year 1264, ruling over Great Poland, he issued a landmark charter defining the rights of Jews within his domain. Approved by the highest officials of the state, this statute became the foundation of Polish Jewish law for generations, modeled on similar charters in Austria and Bohemia. It set down protections against violence, false accusations, and arbitrary punishment. The document opened with a sober recognition of memory and law. Human actions, it declared, fade unless preserved by witnesses or written record. Therefore, Boleslav, Prince of Great Poland, proclaimed for both his contemporaries and his descendants that the Jews living throughout his land were granted defined statutes and privileges binding words, meant to endure. And with that declaration, a new chapter in Jewish life in Poland truly began. The Charter did not speak in vague promises. It spoke in firm, deliberate laws, shaped by fear, experience, and calculation. Its very first clause addressed the deepest danger facing Jews in medieval society, the courtroom. In civil and criminal trials, the word of a Christian alone was no longer enough to condemn a Jew. Testimony against a Jew would be accepted only if it was confirmed by a Jewish witness. In a world where accusation could mean ruin or death, this single rule was a shield of enormous importance. The following provisions laid out the rules for disputes between Christians and Jews, especially those involving pawnbroking and loans. These were not one-sided protections. They were carefully balanced, guarding the interests of the Jewish creditor, while also protecting the Christian debtor from abuse. The law sought order, not favoritism. When disputes arose between Jews themselves, the matter was removed entirely from ordinary municipal courts. Such cases were to be judged either by the prince personally, by his deputy known as the voyevoda, or by a special judge appointed for this purpose. Justice among Jews was thus recognized as a distinct legal sphere, bound to the authority of the ruler rather than the hostility of the street. Violence against Jews was treated as a direct offense against princely power. A Christian who murdered a Jew would be tried before the prince's court and subjected to the full penalty of the law, with his property confiscated. One who wounded a Jew was required to compensate the victim and also pay a fine into the princely treasury. The message was unmistakable. Jewish blood was not without value in the eyes of the state. Clause by clause, the Charter erected further protections. Jewish merchants were not to be harassed on the roads. They were not to be charged higher customs duties than Christians. Jewish cemeteries were not to be desecrated. Synagogues and schools were not to be attacked. Even in the dead of night, if a Jewish home was assaulted, the law demanded action. Christian neighbors were required to come to the aid of the victim when they heard his cries. Those who ignored the call would themselves be fined. Silence, too, was a crime. The Charter went further still, carefully defining the authority of the Jewish judge. This official, appointed to hear cases between Jews, was to sit near the synagogue or in another designated place. His powers were spelled out in detail, leaving no room for doubt or interference. Jewish communal justice was recognized, regulated, and protected. One of the most chilling dangers of the age was addressed directly: the kidnapping of Jewish children for the purpose of forced baptism. The Charter punished such acts severely. Even more striking was its treatment of the blood accusation the claim that Jews murdered Christians for ritual purposes. The law declared these charges groundless, citing papal rulings that had already exposed them as lies. Yet the danger was real enough that the Charter set strict rules. Such an accusation could proceed only if supported by 6 witnesses, 3 Christians and 3 Jews. If the charge were proven, the accused Jew would lose his life. If it were proven false, the Christian accuser would suffer the same fate. Falsehood was no longer safe. All these protections, the Charter declared, were to remain in force for all time. Behind these laws stood a clear intention. The Polish ruler sought to give the Jews conditions of life that would allow them to strengthen the country through trade, finance, and industry, while preserving freedom of conscience and social peace. This was not the whim of a single prince. The document itself emphasized that the highest officials and representatives of the estates had been consulted. It was a collective decision of the secular state. Yet, even as the ink dried on the Charter, another power was moving in the opposite direction. The Church did not see Jews as economic partners or useful settlers, guided by universal religious doctrine rather than local needs. Ecclesiastical authorities worked relentlessly to separate Jews from Christian society. They portrayed Jewish presence as a spiritual danger and sought to reduce Jews to an isolated and despised caste. This effort reached a decisive moment in the year 1266 at the Church Council of Breslau, convened by the papal legate Guido. Its purpose was explicit: to enforce church law in Poland, especially in the ancient diocese of Gnesen. The language of the council revealed its fear. Poland, it declared, was still a new plantation in the soil of Christianity. Because the faith had taken root late and weakly, Christians were said to be especially vulnerable to Jewish influence. The solution was segregation. Jews were forbidden to live among Christians. They were ordered to reside together in houses connected to one another in a separate section of town or village. This Jewish quarter was to be physically divided from Christian dwellings by a hedge, a wall, or a ditch. Jews who owned homes in Christian areas were compelled to sell them as quickly as possible. Other restrictions followed relentlessly. Jews were required to lock themselves inside their houses when church processions passed through the streets. Each city was permitted no more than one synagogue. Jews were ordered to wear a distinctive hat with a horn-like shield, so they could be recognized at a glance. Any Jew found outdoors without this headgear was subject to punishment. Social contact was forbidden. Christians were threatened with excommunication if they invited Jews to meals, ate or drank with them, danced with them, or celebrated weddings with them. Christians were warned not to buy food from Jews who were accused without evidence of poisoning their goods. Older church laws were reaffirmed. Jews were barred from employing Christian servants or nurses. They were forbidden to collect customs duties or hold public office. A Jew accused of relations with a Christian woman faced imprisonment and fines, while the woman was condemned to public whipping and permanent exile. The pressure did not stop at Poland's borders. In the year 1279, a church council held in Buda, in the Kingdom of Hungary, was attended by the highest Polish church leaders. It reinforced the requirement of visible Jewish marks. Jews of both sexes were ordered to wear a red cloth ring sewn onto the left side of their garments. Any Jew found without this sign was to be treated as a vagrant, and Christians were forbidden to trade with him. Similar markings, in saffron color, were imposed on Muslims. The ban on Jewish public service was extended even to Christians of the Greek Orthodox faith. Thus, in the 13th century, Jewish life in Poland was shaped by two opposing forces. As long as older patriarchal conditions endured, and Catholic authority had not yet fully tightened its grip, the church campaign achieved limited results. Jews lived under the protection of the princes and, apart from friction with German settlers, coexisted relatively peacefully with their neighbors. But the clerical leaders were patient. They were planting seeds. Poland, the new plantation of Christianity, was to be trained according to the patterns of older lands. The harvest, they believed, would come in time. The 14th century opened with fire and blood across Western Europe. Jewish communities along the Rhine and in the German lands were shattered by violence of a scale rarely seen before. Armed bands led by figures remembered as Rindfleisch and Armleder swept through towns and villages, murdering Jews under the banner of religious zeal. Soon afterward came the Black Death, arriving like an invisible army. As fear spread faster than the plague itself, Jews were accused of poisoning wells, and entire communities were annihilated. Faced with destruction, tens of thousands fled eastward, searching for a land where order still existed and where the sword of the mob was restrained by law. That land was Poland. At this very moment, Poland itself was being reshaped. In the year 1319, King Władysław Łokietek laid the foundations of a unified Polish state by ending the old feudal fragmentation that had weakened the country for generations. His work was continued, expanded, and perfected by his son Casimir the Great, who ruled from the year 1333 to the year 1370. Casimir was a ruler of rare energy and vision. He strengthened royal authority, founded new cities, rebuilt old ones, and surrounded them with stone walls. He encouraged trade, crafts, and industry, and he extended royal protection not only to nobles and burghers, but even to peasants. Thus, in the year 1344, only 2 years after ascending the throne, Casimir ratified in the city of Krakow the charter originally granted by Boleslav of Kalisz. More than that, he extended its authority to every province of the kingdom. What had once been a regional protection now became the law of all Poland. In the years that followed, from 1346 to 1370, Casimir strengthened this charter with additional provisions. Hostility from city councils and clergy made this necessary. Again and again, the king insisted that Jewish legal cases be removed from the hands of municipal courts and church tribunals and placed under royal jurisdiction. Only the crown, he believed, could guarantee justice. The privileges, he confirmed, were sweeping. Jews were granted freedom of movement throughout the realm. They could reside in cities, towns, and villages. They were permitted to rent and mortgage noble estates. They were authorized to lend money at regulated interest rates, an activity forbidden to Christians by church law, and therefore left almost entirely to Jewish hands. Yet Casimir's concern extended beyond commerce. He sought to affirm the dignity of the Jew as a human being and to weaken the barriers erected by religious intolerance. One clause declared that if a Jew entered the house of a Christian, no one had the right to harm or insult him. Another permitted Jews to enter public bathhouses safely, paying the same fee as Christians and enjoying the same protection. These provisions directly contradicted the Church's efforts to segregate and humiliate. Casimir also regulated the internal organization of Jewish life. A royal official known as the Jewish judge was appointed to oversee Jewish legal matters. This judge, though a Christian, was required to sit in the synagogue or another place chosen by the Jewish community. The task of summoning defendants and serving writs was entrusted to the synagogue beadle. In these measures lay the early outlines of Jewish communal autonomy, which would later develop into a full system of self-government. But even during Casimir's reign, danger did not vanish. In the terrible years of 1348 and 1349, as the Black Death swept eastward from Germany, rumors once again followed in its wake. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, of spreading death deliberately. According to an Italian chronicler, Matteo Villani, as many as 10,000 Jews were killed in Polish towns near the German border in the year 1348. An old Polish chronicle even claimed that Jews were exterminated in nearly all of Poland in the following year. These reports are uncertain and likely exaggerated. Jewish chroniclers who described the horrors of the plague elsewhere made no mention of mass slaughter in Poland. If attacks occurred, they were probably limited to border towns. What is certain is that as violence consumed Germany, great numbers of Jews crossed into Poland and settled there permanently, further strengthening Jewish life in the kingdom. Around this same time emerged one of the most important Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. In the city of Lvov, also known as Lemberg, the capital of Red Russia or Galicia, which Casimir had annexed to Poland, Jews began to establish themselves in significant numbers. In the year 1356, when Casimir granted Magdeburg law to the city, he also granted the Jews the right to be judged according to their own laws. This autonomy was shared with other groups such as Ruthenians, Armenians, and Tatars, reflecting Casimir's inclusive vision of a multi-ethnic state. Casimir's policy toward Jews was consistent with his approach to all foreign settlers. He welcomed those who could help develop the land. Yet even during his lifetime, malicious tongues twisted these acts of statesmanship into scandal. It was whispered that the king favored the Jews not for reasons of policy, but because of his love for a beautiful Jewish woman named Estherka. According to legend, Estherka was the daughter of a tailor. She was said to have captivated the king so completely that in the year 1356 he dismissed a former mistress for her sake. She lived near Krakow in the royal palace of Lobzowo. She bore Casimir 4 children, 2 daughters raised in the Jewish faith, and 2 sons baptized as Christians, who later became ancestors of noble families. Estherka herself, the story claims, was killed during persecutions that followed Casimir's death under his successor, Louis of Hungary. How much of this tale is truth and how much invention cannot be determined. Like many medieval legends, it blends fact, rumor, and political malice into a single narrative. What is clearer is what followed Casimir's death. When Louis of Hungary ruled Poland from the year 1370 to the year 1382, Polish chroniclers described an age in which justice disappeared and the law fell silent. Judges ruled arbitrarily, officials oppressed the people, and resentment spread. Raised in the strict Catholic traditions of Western Europe, Louis pursued the Jews for religious reasons. He threatened expulsion to those who refused to convert to Christianity. Yet his reign in Poland was short and unpopular. He lacked both time and support to dismantle fully the protections established by Casimir, the last king of the Piast dynasty. Only later, under a new ruler, would the balance of power shift decisively. That ruler was the Lithuanian Grand Duke Jagiello, who gained the Polish crown in the year 1386 by marrying Louis's daughter Jadwiga. As the 14th century drew to a close, Poland was pulled ever deeper into the currents of European politics. Catholicism became the bridge binding the kingdom to the West. With it came the growing authority of the Church, universal in ambition and hostile to all difference. King Vladislav Jagiello, who ruled from the year 1386 to the year 1434, had himself converted from paganism to Catholicism and compelled his Lithuanian subjects to do the same. He embraced his new faith with the fervor of a convert and often yielded to clerical pressure. Under his reign, Jews in Poland experienced their first openly religious persecution. In the city of Posen, Jews were accused of bribing a poor Christian woman to steal 3 consecrated hosts from a Dominican church. According to the tale spread among the populace, the hosts were stabbed and thrown into a pit from which blood miraculously flowed, confirming church doctrine. The Archbishop of Posen ordered an investigation. The rabbi of the city, 13 Jewish elders, and the woman accused of theft were arrested. After prolonged torture, they were tied to pillars and slowly burned alive in the year 1399. The Jewish community of Posen was further punished with an eternal fine payable every year to the Dominican Church. This tribute was enforced for centuries, as long as the legend of the 3 hosts survived in the minds of the faithful. As in Western Europe, religious accusations concealed economic motives. Christian burghers envied Jewish success in trade and sought to eliminate competitors. The same forces erupted in the city of Krakow in the year 1407. Jewish merchants had prospered there since the early 14th century. Their wealth aroused jealousy among the burghers, while the clergy resented the sight of Jews living securely under royal protection. Hatred simmered quietly, waiting for a spark. That spark came on the 3rd day of Easter. In the church of St. Barbara, a priest named Budek, infamous for his hatred of Jews, delivered a sermon. As he stepped down from the pulpit, he suddenly announced to the congregation that he had found a message placed there, declaring that the Jews of Krakow had murdered a Christian boy. The Jews living in Krakow killed a Christian boy last night and made sport over his blood. Moreover, they threw stones at a priest who was on his way to visit a sick man and carried a crucifix in his hands. The moment these words were spoken, the fragile barrier between rumor and violence collapsed. The congregation poured out of the church like a flood released from a broken dam. Without inquiry, without proof, the people rushed toward the Jewish quarter. Doors were smashed in, chests broken open, goods dragged into the streets. Houses belonging to those now branded as enemies of Christ were looted in a frenzy of greed and hatred. For a brief moment, royal authority intervened. Soldiers were dispatched, weapons drawn, and by force the rioters were driven back. Order seemed restored, but the calm was an illusion. Several hours later, the bells of the town hall began to ring, calling the city magistrates together. In the restless crowd, someone cried out that the bells were a signal not for justice, but for a renewed assault upon the Jews. Panic and fury surged again. From every corner of the city, the mob ran toward the Jewish streets, now with greater violence than before. This time there was no restraint. Jews were cut down, their homes set ablaze. Flames climbed the walls and leapt from roof to roof. Some of the terrified inhabitants fled to the Tower of St. Anne, believing its stone walls would protect them. But the mob followed. Fire was set to the tower itself. Smoke filled the air, and the refugees were forced to surrender. Many chose conversion as the price of survival. Others were slain. The children of the murdered were seized and baptized. According to the testimony of the Polish historian Jan Długosz, many Christians grew wealthy from the money and goods stolen from Jewish homes. Thus ended the Krakow catastrophe, not as an outburst of blind madness alone, but as an organized plunder cloaked in religious fury. Behind these events stood forces that had come from beyond Poland's borders. From neighboring Germany flowed a new wave of clerical reaction, hardened by the struggle of the Church against the Hussite reform movement. The Great Council of Constance, which condemned Jan Hus, had been attended by the Archbishop of Gnießen, Nicholas Tromba, who led the Polish delegation. Upon his return, this same archbishop presided over the Synod of Kalisz in the year 1420, convened to deal with the Hussite question. At his urging, the council solemnly reaffirmed all the anti-Jewish laws previously issued by the councils of Breslau and Buda. These decrees, long ignored in practice, were now revived with renewed vigor. They forbade social contact between Jews and Christians, ordered Jews to live in separate quarters, and required them to wear distinctive marks on their clothing. In addition, Jews were compelled to pay special taxes to the churches of the diocese where they now live and where by right Christians ought to live, supposedly as compensation for losses inflicted upon Christians. The clergy were instructed to enforce these rules rigorously throughout their districts. Gradually, the spirit of ecclesiastical hostility seeped into secular law. Church agitators gained influence not only over the king, but also over the landed nobility, the Szlachta, which was beginning to assert itself politically. At an assembly held in the town of Warta in the year 1423, King Władysław Jagiello approved a statute forbidding Jews to lend money on written securities, allowing only loans secured by physical pledges. The justification was venomous and revealing, accusing Jewish cunning of being forever directed against Christians and their property. While Poland moved down this path of growing intolerance, a very different reality prevailed to the northeast. Lithuania, though joined to Poland by dynastic union, remained administratively independent. There, the old patriarchal order still survived. The land of forests and rivers along the Niemen had only recently emerged from paganism, and the rigid structures of medieval Christian society had not yet taken root. Jews were able to settle there without encountering the organized hatred that marked life in Poland. By the end of the 14th century, established Jewish communities already existed in Brest, Grodno, Troki, Lutsk, and Vladimir in Volhynia. The ruler who first gave these communities firm legal standing was the Lithuanian Grand Duke Witold, who reigned from the year 1388 to 1430. In the year 1388, the Jews of Brest and other towns received from him a charter closely resembling the statutes of Boleslav of Kalisz and Casimir the Great. In the following year, even broader privileges were granted to the Jews of Grodno. Witold's laws reflected a concern for peaceful coexistence and communal stability. Jews in Lithuania were recognized as free citizens under the direct protection of the Grand Duke. They lived in self-governing communities, managing their religious and property affairs independently. In criminal matters, they answered to the local royal officials, and in the most serious cases, directly to the ruler himself. Their rights were extensive. The law guaranteed personal safety, protection of property, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, and equal access to commerce and trade. Jews sold goods in marketplaces and shops, practiced crafts, and in some cases worked the land. Wealthier individuals lent money at interest, leased customs duties and taxes from the Grand Duke, and held estates either outright or as tenants. Their taxes were adjusted to their occupations and were generally moderate. Alongside Rabbinite Jews lived Karaite Jews, who had come from the Crimean Peninsula and settled particularly around Troki and Lutsk. For this reason, Lithuania became a destination for Jewish migrants traveling eastward. Many who passed through Poland continued on and made Lithuania their permanent home. Beyond Lithuania, however, the road closed. The lands of Muscovy and Russia remained almost entirely inaccessible to Jews. The struggle between royal authority and clerical power reached a dramatic peak during the reign of Casimir IV, who ruled Poland from the year 1447 to 1492. Educated in the spirit of Renaissance humanism, Casimir initially acted as a protector of all his subjects. As Grand Duke of Lithuania, he had upheld the tolerant policies of Witold, safeguarding both Rabbinite and Karaite Jews, and granting the latter Magdeburg Law in the year 1441. Jewish financiers and tax farmers continued to play a vital role in state finances. After ascending the Polish throne, Casimir attempted to govern independently of the clergy. In August of the year 1447, while visiting the city of Posen, a devastating fire destroyed much of the city, including the original charter granted by Casimir the Great to the Jews. Representatives from Jewish communities petitioned the king to restore their privileges using surviving copies. Casimir agreed at once, declaring that he wished the Jews, whom he intended to protect for the good of the realm and the treasury, to feel secure under his reign. The renewed charter confirmed freedom of residence and trade, judicial autonomy, and protection against violence and false accusations. It directly contradicted church decrees recently reaffirmed by ecclesiastical councils. It allowed social interaction between Jews and Christians and removed Jews from the jurisdiction of church courts. This act enraged the clergy. Leading the opposition was Cardinal Zbigniew Olesnicki, Archbishop of Krakow, who accused the king of insulting the Christian faith. In a letter written in May of the year 1454, he warned Casimir that no ruler was powerful enough to defy the church where matters of faith were concerned, and demanded the revocation of Jewish privileges. Olesnicki found an ally in the papal legate Giovanni Capistrano, notorious for his hatred of Jews, who arrived in Poland in the autumn of the year 1453. In fiery sermons delivered in public squares, Capistrano demanded the abolition of Jewish rights and threatened divine punishment if the king refused. At first, Casimir resisted, but war intervened. Poland was engaged in conflict with the Teutonic Order, and when Polish forces suffered a major defeat in September of the year 1454, the clergy proclaimed it a sign of God's wrath for protecting Jews. Under immense pressure from both clergy and nobility, the king yielded. In November of that year, the Statute of Nicaea was issued. It annulled all previous Jewish privileges, declaring them contrary to divine and earthly law. Jews, it proclaimed, should not enjoy greater rights than Christians. The older restrictive laws were restored. Clericalism had won. Violence followed swiftly. In the year 1463, bands of volunteers traveling through Krakow on their way to a crusade against the Turks attacked Jewish residents, killing about 30 people and looting their homes. Similar riots erupted in other cities. Though Casimir personally remained inclined to protect the Jews, under his sons, the hostile policy hardened. King John Albrecht reaffirmed the restrictive statutes and is credited with establishing the first Jewish ghetto in Poland. After a fire devastated Krakow in the year 1494, Jews were ordered to leave their scattered dwellings and resettle in Kazimierz, a suburb that became an entirely Jewish town. In Lithuania, meanwhile, Grand Duke Alexander initially favored the Jews, but in the year 1495, he suddenly expelled them, confiscating their property. Most fled to Poland. After becoming King of Poland in the year 1501, Alexander reversed the decree, allowing the Jews to return and reclaim much of what they had lost. By the close of this era, Polish Jewry had emerged as a major economic and social force. Having long stood under German influence, it now stood on the threshold of an independent spiritual development, one that would define the next chapter of its history. As we draw the curtain on this chapter of Jewish history in Poland, the story that emerges is one of vivid contrasts, painted in both light and shadow. On one hand, there is a community that thrives, its members influential in commerce and royal finances, shaping the economic life of the emerging Polish state. On the other hand, these same communities exist under a constant cloud of suspicion, prejudice, and the unpredictable whims of politics. Protection from kings and magnates was never absolute, granted only when it suited the interests of those in power, while the urban authorities, zealous clerics, and restless street mobs could turn law and custom into instruments of oppression at a moment's notice. From the careful legal shields offered under Boleslav the Pious to the chilling spectacles of ritual murder trials in the era of Sigismund III and Vladislav IV, the Jews of Poland lived in a delicate balance. They navigated prosperity and peril, autonomy and hostility, faith and the constant threat of false accusations. Every coin they minted, every estate they farmed, every trade they conducted, carried with it the hidden tension between opportunity and danger, between royal favor and popular enmity. And yet, even amid these dangers, a foundation was being laid. The seeds of cultural flourishing, of intellectual life, and of communal organization were quietly taking root. Poland was becoming more than a refuge. It was becoming a home for Jewish life that would grow in richness, depth, and resilience. Next, in Chapter 3, the autonomous center in Poland at its zenith 1501 to 1648, the drama intensifies. Poland emerges as a crucible of Jewish culture, a place where religious, social, and economic autonomy reaches its fullest expression, but the shadows are never far away. The Jesuits rise to power, religious fanaticism spreads through the cities, and the delicate protections offered by the monarchy are tested as never before. The stage is set for suspense and confrontation. Will these communities preserve their hard-won autonomy, or will the combined forces of clerical zeal, urban hostility, and manipulative law tear apart the foundations of Poland's golden Jewish center? The next chapter promises intrigue, trials, and a drama that will challenge the resilience of an entire people, and the answers, as always in history, are never simple.